There is no shortage of expectations in college football.
The best class ever.
It has to be our year.
Number one class in the country.
Recruiting
My commitment to
ignites these expectations. Players are sorted and ranked before they even play a college game. But just how accurate are these rankings? How good are we at predicting potential?
Generational talent.
After combing through years of college football rankings, NFL drafts, and NFL seasons, the results were fascinating. They certainly surprised me. This is a story about the greatest public human ranking system ever created. Rankings are a prediction, and the delicate art of predicting the unwritten play that lie ahead, this is the job of a scout. The life of a scout is nothing short of strange. Your job requires an obsession with high school football players. This obsession isn't unfounded, though. In fact, this obsession has to do with what many consider to be the biggest show in the biggest economy: college football. Recruiting has become something that even the godfather of the 40-yard dash couldn't envision. When Paul Brown lined up players decades ago for the drill, he was just trying to figure out who should cover a punt. Who'd want to watch that? Over time, that drill has become a spectacle, a way for all to participate in the evaluation process. A few tenths of a second is the difference between fast and slow, unranked or 5 stars, millions or undrafted. For years, navigating this labyrinth of player potentiality was based entirely on snap judgments from coaches and scouts, objective measurements that was met with the same type of distaste as, well, talking back to a coach. That was a challenge to the power of a coach's eye. So how did this change? Well, in 1998, one man sought to bring the obsessed fans into this labyrinth. And from there, the strangeness of a scout was further normalized. Want evidence? Well, on signing day in 2007, Rivals drew 74.5 million site views, more than 5 times what MSNBC had just a few months earlier on election night. And today, of course, it's even bigger. There are several recruiting sites, and one in particular, 247sports.com, has dethroned Rivals. So everybody agrees that these sites are a gateway for the fan, but any coach that downplays their significance or says it's solely for the fan is almost certainly lying, because the public eye will grade them upon it every year.
Top ranked class in program history.
But just how accurate are these sites, and what do these stars even mean? The scale is simple. For most major sites, a 5-star is someone who is believed to be a future first-rounder. A 4-star is believed to be a future NFL pick any round. Each year, there are roughly 30 to 34 players who are bestowed this 5-star award, as there are 32 first-round draft picks. We studied the classes of 2011 through 2020 to evaluate draft accuracy, and of the 334 5-stars in those classes, 70 of them were drafted in the first round, giving us an accuracy of about 21%. There were 3,252 4-stars, and 646 of those were drafted, giving us an accuracy of 20%. Now, that's a failing grade in any exam, but not everybody is Myles Garrett. That's a defensive lineman. Each additional star increased the likelihood of being drafted significantly. Over half of all the 5-stars were drafted. And that is far better than I would have expected. I wouldn't have guessed that more than half of these guys would get drafted, because they're 18 years old when this evaluation period ends. They're a full 3 years of development away from the NFL draft. They haven't even played in a college game. But there is a lot more to this, because the road doesn't just end for these players after they get drafted. The question from here becomes, who's actually good? This is an important distinction, because as players progress past the NFL draft, these rankings look different. Real quick, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. A 2018 paper looked at whether high school rankings accurately predicted NFL success and found that while stars correlated significantly with draft position, there were conflicting results for what one might consider NFL success. Star rankings didn't really seem to relate to how much playing time a player would see in a season, and it also didn't really relate to their overall cash earnings. Now, while this is very telling, we don't want to solely rely on it. It obviously isn't proven science. So I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the very best all-pro teams. So we pulled roughly the last decade of all-pro teams. If we go back any further than that, we're going to have some dudes from the dark ages that really pre-existed this internet age, these ranking sites. So, were five-star recruits more likely to become all-pros? Slightly, but not by much. Only 13% of all-pros were five-star recruits. Nearly 60% weren't even expected to play in the NFL. Now, with many sports, it would seem that when we look to the extremes, we find prodigies. LeBron James, Tiger Woods, players that were highly touted all along. In football, that's not so much the case. The further away we get from high school, the less accurate these rankings become. And that's some combination of two possibilities. The first is these players are just developing differently over that period of time. The second, this ranking system is just ranking them inaccurately. Pause for a moment. What is it that makes football such a unique sport? Think about the typical offensive lineman. Now think about the typical cornerback. Slightly different athletes, to say the least. The variance of heights and weights between different positions is more pronounced than perhaps any other major sport. Football deploys a wide range of athletes for different positions. Some of these positions, scouts seem to be able to discern. They can tell who's going to be legit. For others, it's the weather 10 days out. Coming back to our all-pro charts, running back rankings are incredibly accurate. Of the 55 all-pros since 2012, 38 of them were 5 or 4 stars coming out of high school. Nearly 70% of these all-pros were already expected to play in the NFL when they were teenagers. That was the highest of any position group. Why are running backs so much easier to evaluate? Well, here's a hint. The career lifespan of a running back isn't great. At the highest level, just the slightest loss of step, and the next guy has your job. Anybody who's ever played fantasy football is aware of this. Running backs are the frequent flyers of the waiver wire. One would expect that such an injury-riddled position would be full of a wider range of high school star recruits. So what's going on? Well, consider what makes a running back great. Speed, agility, size, strength, all measurable traits. Obviously, field vision and other qualities are important, but you don't see any great running backs that have some impressive combination of quick and strong or fast. To further this point, what offensive position is most similar to running back? Wide receiver. Again, a position where the objective measurements were highly correlated with long-term success, but this correlation quickly faded for many other positions. Certainly the most important position in all of sports.
Season Tom Brady.
Of the 31 all-pro quarterback selections since 2012, 25 of them were not expected to be NFL quarterbacks. They had a ranking of 3 stars or less leaving high school. 80% were not expected to be in the NFL.
No star, no offer guy out of high school.
The position with the most eyeballs received the lowest grade.
Jimmy Clausen was the
Arm
number one
strength,
player.
height, speed, all of this can be measured, but what lies indoors? Getting chased by 5'10", 190-pound high school defensive linemen just doesn't really create the same level of anxiety as this. In reading high school defenses, that just doesn't really require the same mental arithmetic as this. That was a pretty good ball, too. Given that evaluating neurons is outside of the question for the moment, we're left with high school game film and 7-on-7 camps to decide who the next savior is. And it shows. Just take a look at the top 10 winning quarterbacks since 2000. Only one, Peyton Manning, was expected to play in the NFL. In fact, we have to go all the way down to 14 before we find another. Now keep in mind that if a kid gets an FBS offer, they pretty much automatically get a 2 or 3 star ranking. It's an insurance policy of sorts for these ranking sites. And one has to ask the question, does that even really mean that they're ranked.
I'm not really sure, I guess, but let's take a look at the position. So what else stood out positionally?
Well, the trenches. On one side, defensive ends and defensive tackles were incredibly accurate. There were more five-star defensive tackles that made an all-pro team than any other position. We can hypothesize why. One reason might be the lack of intangibles needed relative to other positions, as the Kelsey brothers pointed out.
D end.
It's definitely the easiest medal.
See ball, get ball.
Again, I'm speaking broadly here, as there's obviously exceptions to any broad-based point. It's not like defensive linemen don't have to work hard or there's no intangibles required to play the position. But similar to running backs and wide receivers, much of what makes a defensive lineman great is his tangibles, at least relative to the other positions. But on the other side of the trenches, a far different story emerges. Offensive linemen have always been incredibly hard to evaluate. This is a long-standing problem. Even Coach Orgeron talked about this 20 years ago in the book Meat Market. It's kind of a funny name. While nearly 60% of all-pro defensive linemen were 4 or 5 stars and thus expected to play in the NFL, only 27% of offensive linemen were 4 or 5 stars. So what is it that makes these big little dudes so challenging to evaluate? Well, for one, many of these high school linemen are 250 pounds when they graduate, so it's difficult to know who will fill into their frame. And for those that do have the frame, you might not know who's willing to get in shape and cut weight, analogous to the 6'10 guy who's got a scully just because he's 6'10. It's also more challenging to evaluate blocking than it is, say, this. At least that's what 247 sports recruiting director would confess. So what's your best chance at evaluating any lineman? Getting them to camp. It's similar to any position, but in a way, you're kind of just taking chances on a big dude because there's maybe not as many big dudes. Back to our defense. What about the next platoon, the reinforcements to our D-line? There was only one 5-star inside or middle linebacker that became an all-pro in our charts, and cornerbacks also had a relatively low percentage of 4 and 5 stars, likely due to the fact that so few elite cornerbacks will play the position in high school. And that's true for essentially all of these positions, but it's perhaps the greatest example at cornerback. I mean, just think, if you're a coach, you probably don't want to isolate your best athlete, a D1 athlete, on one side of the field in just one space. You probably want them playing safety or linebacker, roaming the field so they can make more plays. Something that I kind of took away looking into this, these ranking sites aren't trying to determine who the best college players will be. They're trying to rank kids based on NFL draft potential. That is an important distinction. Because if we look into where players are drafted and draft rate instead of all-pro teams, positional accuracies tell a completely different story. 5-star quarterbacks and tackles were the most accurate. They were the most likely to be taken in the first round. This was the opposite of our all-pro findings. So what does this tell us? Well, teams take a lot of swings on quarterbacks and offensive tackles in the first round, probably because of their relative positional importance. However, in my belief, this further highlights the inefficiency of the draft. Curious about this, I graphed and detailed out the efficiency of a draft in another video. Would really encourage you to check it out if you haven't. I found the results fascinating. Now, there's one position that teams seem to have figured out. Running backs were also underrepresented in the data. Again, the opposite of what we found for the all-pro teams, likely due to the fact that fewer NFL teams are taking running backs in earlier rounds because of this shorter lifespan. But what leapt out at me was the inaccuracy of linebackers. If you remember, only one interior all-pro linebacker was a 5-star recruit. And if we look at draft accuracy of 4 and 5 stars, well, linebackers had the worst accuracy. There are at least 2 reasons for this. What makes a linebacker great isn't just athleticism. They have to be able to survey the offense, call the plays. I mean, in a lot of ways, They are the quarterback of the defense.
Consider this play within just a fraction of a second by Eric Kendricks. He needs to read first, is this a run? Is this a pass? He identifies that it's a pass. Next he needs to see, is this running back going to come out of the backfield into his zone? Is the receiver going to come on a crossing route into his zone? Is Jimmy Garoppolo just going to take off and run? The intangibles are incredibly important for this position.
The second reason? Well, the position has just evolved. Understandably, it's those intangibles that scouts struggle evaluating. To summarize our findings, it appears as though high school rankings correlate far more with the positions that require the most relative tangibles, and vice versa. It's drastically easier to spot a Dalvin Cook than a Patrick Mahomes, a Myles Garrett, instead of a Fred Warner. Obviously, these rankings are not perfect, and there's anecdotal exceptions in many different ways, but they do correlate highly with team success. Proof? There are 134 FBS schools, but not a single one of those schools has won a championship without a top 10 recruiting class. All 23 champions since these rankings came into existence had at least one top 10 class.
Success should follow Reggie.
So rankings are highly correlated with winning. They might not correlate significantly with the elites, and there might be several positions that are kind of crapshoots, but top programs win because they have the top recruits.
Here with Tua Tagovailoa.
I struggled to find much of anything that tracked these players after their stars were granted. We had to collect and summarize basically all of this data on our own. Of course, there's no shortage of information, forums, and rankings before the players actually play. And I don't think that's coincidental. There really is something so magnetic about anticipation. 5 stars, celestial beams anointing a teenager, the promise of a career that has not begun, that superlative moment between today and tomorrow. And lastly, something that came to me. Is a player really a bust just because they're not who we thought they were? Just because they're not who the rankings thought they were? Perhaps we should reserve that term for somebody that seemingly pisses away their talent. Being an overrated 18-year-old shouldn't be thought of as a character defect. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and take care.